The rain that falls on Nostromo does not cleanse. It is a baptism of chemical filth, a ceaseless whisper of corrosion that scours the surfaces of the planet's adamantium hive spires and seeps into the very soul of its people. It is a percussion of despair drumming against the ferrocrete and the fluted ornate architecture of a world that has never known the gentle kiss of a natural sun. Down in the suffocating gloom of the underhives, where the planet's heart of adamantium was long ago mined to a hollow core, light is a commodity and life is a currency spent in brutal, swift transactions. This is the cradle of Konrad Curze, a world forged in darkness, greed, and the casual cruelty of survival. And in the final moments, as he sits upon a throne of articulated bone and fused agony, it is this rain he hears a final lullaby from a home he himself had sentenced to death. His thoughts are not a river, but a fractured sea of glass, each shard a reflection of a horror yet to come, or a pain long since past. The visions have always been his only true companions, more real than the fleeting warmth of brotherhood, more constant than the hollow proclamations of his father, the Emperor. They churn within him now a maelstrom of prophecy and memory. He sees the golden light of the Great Crusade, a glorious lie, painting over a canvas of galactic subjugation. He sees the faces of his brothers etched with a nobility that would curdle into betrayal, ambition, and damnation. Sanguinius, the beautiful angel, falling from the sky with broken wings, his lifeblood staining the brass walls of a traitor's battle barge. Ferrus Manus, the iron-willed, his head a trophy, his silver eyes forever extinguished. He sees the eagle banners proud and defiant, drowning in a tide of their own blood on the black sands of Istvan Fev. He sees Horus, the favored son, the brightest star, becoming a black hole of ambition, his soul a gaping wound through which the filth of the warp would pour into reality. These are not dreams. They are truths screaming to be heard, yet they were always dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. Did the Emperor not see, when Curze stood before him, a feral king in a palace of bones, and laid the future bare, a future of civil war and cosmic sorrow, his father saw only a damaged tool to be repurposed. The golden gaze of the master of mankind offered no solace, no understanding, only a demand for compliance. He was given a legion, the Waheneth, carved from the shadows of terror, and commanded to bring the Emperor's light to the galaxy. But how could he spread light when his own soul was a vessel for all-consuming darkness? How could he forge peace with tools of terror? The central agonizing question has gnawed at him for a century, a cancer in his psyche. Is the future a path of stone, immutable and absolute, where every step, every choice is merely an illusion leading to a preordained destination? Or is it a raging river whose course can be diverted by the will of a single powerful soul? He had tried. Oh, he had tried. He had screamed his prophecies until his throat was raw, warning his brothers of the paths they were walking. He had shown Fulgrim the slithering corruption that awaited him, only to be met with disgust and revulsion. He had confronted Dawn, the stoic Praetorian, with the inevitability of his failure, trying to shatter his arrogance with the hammer of truth, only to be branded a heretic and a madman. Each attempt to avert the catastrophe he foresaw only seemed to seat the stones of that dreadful path more firmly in place. His every action, born of a desperate desire to prevent the bloodshed, became a catalyst for the very betrayals he predicted. He became the monster they accused him of being because the script of destiny demanded a villain. And now the final act approaches. He can feel her, the assassin, a sliver of darkness moving through the labyrinth of his fortress. A perfect killer sent by the hypocrite on his golden throne to silence a son who knew too much. He has foreseen her arrival for years. He has watched her training in his visions, felt her dedication, her focus. She is a weapon as he once was. But unlike him, she is ignorant of the grand, terrible play in which she is a key player. She believes she is an instrument of justice. The irony is a poison so bitter it almost makes him smile. His entire life has been a pursuit of justice, a brutal, uncompromising, and honest form of it. He punished the guilty. He ripped the cancer of crime from Nostramo with his bare hands. He brought worlds to compliance not with empty promises, but with the cold, hard truth of fear. His methods were condemned, yet they were effective. The Imperium he served, however, spoke of honor and righteousness, while it committed genocide on a galactic scale. And now it sends a secret killer to murder one of its own sons in the shadows. There is no escape. The vision of his own death is the clearest of all. The whisper of her blade, the cold finality of its entry, the surprised look in her eyes as he offers no resistance. He has seen it 1,000 times. He could stop her. He could tear her limb from limb before she takes a single step into his throne room. His Night Lords, the tattered remnants of his once proud legion, could be alerted. But to what end to live another day in this tortured existence, to further delay the inevitable and prove his own visions false? No, the prophecy must be fulfilled. His death is the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. It will be his testament written in his own blood. It will prove that he saw the future. It will prove that the Emperor is a tyrant who murders his own sons. It will prove that the Imperium's justice is a lie. His entire miserable existence from the lightless abyss of Nostramo to this final silent moment has been a singular, agonizing scream for vindication. And in the approaching footsteps of his executioner, he can finally hear the echo. The sky of Nostramo Quintus did not welcome its fallen son. It tried to unmake him. The gestation capsule, a vessel of imperial science designed to protect a demigod, was instead a cannonball of fire and shrieking metal. It tore through the perpetual toxic smog that served as the planet's atmosphere, a brief angry star in a starless night. It did not land. It impacted. The capsule breached the planet's adamantium crust, a geological impossibility, a testament to the violent energy of its descent and the sheer unnatural resilience of the infant within. It plunged through kilometers of rock and hive city foundations past forgotten underlevels and the lightless domains of chem scavengers finally coming to rest deep within the planet's hollow, weeping core. The impact should have atomized any living thing. Instead, from the mangled wreckage, a child emerged. He was alone, bathed not in the light of a loving father, but in the radioactive glow of the planet's geothermal vents. There were no gentle hands, no guiding words. His first breath was of Nostramo's poison. His first sight was of endless darkness. His first lesson was that to exist was to survive, and to survive was to be utterly, terrifyingly alone. He had no name, so the darkness gave him one, a whisper, a dread rumor, the Night Haunter. His first hunt was not an act of desperation, but of purpose. He was still a youth, barely more than a child by mortal standards, yet he moved with a predator's grace that belied his years. His senses, honed by the lightless environment, were preternatural. He could hear the frantic beat of a liar's heart across a crowded slum market, smell the cold sweat of a murderer hiding in the shadows. He watched the criminal syndicates, the slave traders, the corrupt enforcers who preyed upon the weak, and he felt not pity for their victims, but a cold, burning rage at the injustice. Justice to him was not a concept to be debated in gilded halls. It was a physical law like gravity. Crime was a dissonance in the fabric of reality, and it was his purpose to correct it. He stalked a notorious gang leader, a man who had built an empire on the broken bodies of children. He did not challenge him. He dismantled his empire piece by piece. He took his lieutenants one by one, leaving their mutilated remains as warnings. Finally, he came for the leader himself. The man was found the next morning impaled upon the iron spikes of his own fortress gate, his skin flayed and draped like a banner for all to see. There was no trial, no appeal. There was only the crime and the punishment delivered with surgical, horrifying precision. He was not taught justice. He was justice in its most primal, terrifying form. In time, the name Night Haunter became a god-killer. It was a word that could stop a rampaging mob, a phrase that could make the most hardened criminals abandon their spoils and flee into the toxic wastes. He waged a one-man war against the entirety of Nostramo's corrupt power structure. He was a ghost, a rumor, an impossibility. He moved through the hives like a phantom, his only heraldry, the screams of his victims, and the silence that followed. He did not seek to rule, not at first. He sought only to cleanse. But the absence of crime created a vacuum, and into that vacuum he was inevitably drawn. The people living for the first time without the daily terror of the syndicates began to look to their unseen savior. The silence in the streets was not peace, it was a collective held breath, an entire population waiting for the monster in the dark to pass them by. Eventually, the old thrones of the crime lords were empty, and so he took his own. In the heart of the largest hive, he built a palace not of gold or stone, but of the bones of those he had judged. He sat upon a throne crafted from the fused rib cages of 1,000 tyrants, a silent, brooding king whose crown was the absolute, paralyzing fear of his subjects. Nostramo was orderly. Nostramo was productive. Nostramo was quiet. It was a planet pacified by a nightmare ruled by a ghost. For generations, the only light to pierce the gloom of Nostramo's cities was the jaundiced, sickly glow of chem lamps and the angry orange of industrial furnaces. The sky was a myth, a story told to frighten children. Then the sky burned. It was a light unlike any the Nostramans had ever seen, not the flickering, desperate light of their technology, but a brilliant golden and absolute illumination that banished the shadows and seemed to physically press down upon the planet. It was the light of 1,000 suns, the reflected glory of a vast fleet that had punctured the veil of the void. For the first time, the people of the hives looked up and saw not a ceiling of smog, but the majestic, terrifying silhouettes of warships hanging in the heavens like gods. Panic, a sentiment long suppressed by the fear of the Night Haunter, erupted in the streets. But in his palace of bone, Konrad Curze felt no fear. He felt only the cold, dull certainty of a prophecy coming to pass. The arrival he had foreseen was at hand. The being who descended from the heavens called himself the Emperor, and he walked through the terrified city with an aura of such power and charisma that mortals fell to their knees in his presence. He was clad in golden armor, a figure of myth and legend, the antithesis of everything Nostramo represented. His custodians, giants in auramite, followed in his wake, their very presence a rebuke to the planet's grime and decay. They marched to the Bone Palace, and the Emperor entered alone, unafraid. He found his son Konrad Curze waiting for him on his throne of judgment. The contrast was absolute, the golden savior of humanity, and the pale, dark-eyed king of a world of fear. But Curze was not awed. He had seen this moment in his nightmares 1,000 times. He looked into his father's eyes and did not see a savior. He saw a gilded tyrant, a master of beautiful lies. In a torrent of words and psychic impressions, Curze unleashed his visions. He showed the Emperor the future he had foreseen, the full scope of the tragedy to come. He showed him Horus wreathed in chaotic fire, standing over the broken body of Sanguinius. He showed him the iron cage of terror, a world of worship and dogma, its people suffocating under the weight of the very godhood the Emperor claimed to deny. He showed him the civil war that would burn the galaxy and turn brother against brother. It was a warning, a desperate plea for his father to understand, to see the rot at the heart of his own grand design. The Emperor listened, his perfect face impassive. When Curze was finished, the master of mankind acknowledged his son's prophetic power, his unique and terrible sight. But he dismissed the visions. He called them dark dreams, the scars of a troubled upbringing on a savage world, specters that the light of his imperium would surely banish. He saw the power, but ignored the truth it revealed. It was the ultimate rejection. Despite the hollow feeling of being utterly and completely misunderstood, Curze accepted. A flicker of hope, stubborn and foolish, ignited within him. Perhaps his father was right. Perhaps out there in the vast expanse of the galaxy serving a greater purpose, these nightmares would fade. Perhaps by taking his place among his brothers, he could find a way to steer the future away from the abyss. He abdicated his throne of bone, leaving the governance of Nostramo to a council of terrified nobles. He walked out of his dark palace and into the blinding, artificial light of the Emperor's glory. As he boarded the flagship, leaving the perpetual night of his homeworld behind Konrad Curze, the newly acknowledged Primarch of the 8th Legion allowed himself a moment of belief. He was no longer a lonely ghost. He was a son, a general, a part of a dream. It was a beautiful lie, and for a short time he chose to believe it. The warriors of the 8th Legion, born from the gene seed of Konrad Curze, were children of the night long before they met their primogenitor. Recruited from the ancient, light-deprived prisons and tunnels of Old Terra, they were already predisposed to shadow and silence. They were pale with wide, dark eyes and possessed a grim, fatalistic nature. When Curze was finally reunited with them, he did not see disciplined soldiers in the mold of Dawn's imperial fists, or noble paladins like the sons of Sanguinius. He saw himself. He saw thousands of reflections of his own alienation, his own comfort in the darkness. He looked upon their faces and recognized the same grim understanding of the universe's brutal realities. They did not need to be reshaped in his image. They were already cast from the same die. He renamed them at once. They would no longer be the nameless Bavith. They would be the Night Lords, and their name would become synonymous with the fear they were born to inspire. His first compliance campaign with his legion set the tone for their entire history. The target was a human civilization on the planet of Chiraut, a world that had openly defied the offer of imperial unity. Another Primarch might have planned a glorious assault, a swift, decisive battle to break the enemy's armies and topple their leaders. Curze had no interest in such vainglorious displays. War to him was not about glory. It was about results. And the most efficient path to victory was not through the bodies of soldiers, but through the minds of their leaders and the hearts of their populace. The attack did not begin with a bombardment. It began with a whisper. Vox channels across the planet were hijacked, broadcasting hours of agonizing screams punctuated by guttural promises of the fate that awaited them. Key planetary leaders vanished from their fortified bunkers, only to reappear days later, their dismembered bodies raining down on the mourning parades of their own troops. Power grids would fail, plunging entire hive cities into terrifying darkness. And in that darkness, the Night Lords would hunt, taking only a select few, leaving behind picked recordings of their brutal work for all to see. The campaign was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The rulers of Chiraut, driven to paranoia and madness, began executing their own staff, suspecting traitors at every turn. The army's morale evaporated, soldiers deserting their posts rather than face the unseen phantoms that haunted the night. The citizens locked in their homes lived in a state of constant nerve-shredding dread. There was no grand battle, no moment of heroic confrontation. The will of the planet was not broken. It was meticulously dissolved in a bath of pure terror. After a month of this torment, the planetary government broadcast its unconditional surrender, begging the Imperium to save them from the Night Lords. Curze had conquered an entire world with minimal losses to his own legion, achieving his objective with ruthless efficiency. This victory, however, did not earn him praise. It earned him a reputation. Word of his method spread throughout the fleets of the Great Crusade. His legion was no longer seen as an army of liberation, but as a host of ghouls and executioners. The other Primarchs, his brothers, began to view him with suspicion and contempt. Robuta Guilliman, the master of logistics and orthodox warfare, saw his tactics as inefficient and barbaric. The noble Leman Russ saw them as dishonorable, a coward's way of fighting. Rogel Dorn, the Praetorian of Terror, saw them as nothing more than the methods of a butcher, a stain upon the Emperor's grand vision. They saw the cruelty, but they refused to see the purpose behind it. They condemned his means even as they benefited from his ends. Curze in turn saw their posturing and their talk of honor as a childish refusal to look at the true face of the galaxy and the necessary ugly work of forging an empire. The first seeds of true division were sown not in open conflict, but in the disdainful glances and whispered condemnations in the war councils of the Great Crusade. The visions were worsening. Once they were fleeting nightmares, flashes of a potential terrible future. Now they were becoming a constant agonizing torrent, a bleed of future pain into his present reality. The screams of the dying on battlefields yet to be fought echoed in his quiet moments. The stench of betrayal was a constant acrid taste in the back of his throat. This growing torment frayed his already thin patience for the pleasantries and hypocrisies of his brothers. In the strategic meetings of the Primarchs, a pantheon of demigods planning the fate of the galaxy, Curze became an uncomfortable presence, a specter of grim reality amidst their talk of glory. His arguments were blunt, his justifications for his legion's tactics stark and stripped of pretense. A particularly heated debate arose following a string of his terror campaigns. Rogel Dorn, his face a mask of rigid disapproval, publicly condemned the Night Lord's methods. "You do not make war," Konrad Dorn's voice boomed across the strategium, cold and hard as the stone he loved to shape. "You engage in mass butchery. You rule through fear, a tool for tyrants and cowards, not the enlightened path of the Imperium." Curze laughed, a dry, rasping sound that set everyone on edge. Enlightened, he retorted, his voice low and dangerous. "You speak of enlightenment while you order worlds to be bombarded into glass for refusing your glorious Imperium. You are the hypocrite brother. You hide your butchery behind words like honor and necessity. I am simply honest about what I am. Fear is a tool, yes, the most effective tool we have. It saves lives. My campaigns end with a scalpel's precision, leaving the infrastructure intact and the populace pacified. Your glorious charges leave worlds in ashes. Tell me, brother, which of us is the true butcher?" The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Dorn, ever the stoic, simply stared back, his contempt a palpable force. Curze had not won a friend. He had made the enmity of the Emperor's most steadfast son absolute. His sight then turned upon another brother, the beautiful and peacock-proud Fulgrim. During a brief respite from battle, Curze was struck by a vision of such horrifying clarity that he physically recoiled. He saw Fulgrim the Phoenician no longer perfect. He saw his flawless skin marred by a serpentine corruption, his eyes glowing with a depraved light. He saw him wielding a demon-forged blade, whispering temptations to his most loyal sons, leading them down a path of hedonistic excess and damnation. He saw the proud, purple banners of the Emperor's children, defiled their glorious purpose, twisted into the pursuit of sensory depravity and monstrous perfection. The vision was so real, so visceral, that Curze felt the phantom touch of chaos slithering over his own skin. He had to warn him. He cornered Fulgrim, grabbing his arm with a strength that made the Phoenician wince. His words came out in a ragged, desperate torrent. He described the demon, the blade, the fall. He spoke of forbidden pleasures and the ultimate betrayal of the self. But his delivery was that of a madman. His eyes were wide with remembered horror, his voice a frantic rasp. Fulgrim, the perfectionist, the aesthete, was utterly repulsed. He saw not a concerned brother, but a lunatic spewing filth and insanity. He pulled his arm away, his face a mask of disgust. "Keep your gutter-born nightmares to yourself," Konrad Fulgrim hissed, turning his back on him. "Do not seek to stain me with the contents of your broken mind." That rejection was a turning point. It was not the anger of dawn which was predictable, but the revulsion of Fulgrim that truly wounded him. He had tried to save his brother, to pull him back from a precipice only he could see, and in return he was treated as something unclean. He began to understand. No one would listen. No one could listen. His prophecies were not seen as warnings, but as the symptoms of his own madness, the projections of his own dark soul onto others. He was alone adrift in a sea of future suffering that only he could perceive. The belief that he could change things, the foolish hope he had clung to upon leaving Nostramo, was dying. He was a prophet in a world of the blind, and they hated him for describing the darkness they could not see. The isolation he had known in the depths of Nostramo returned, but this time it was worse. Before he had been physically alone. Now he was surrounded by 20 brothers, and he had never felt more isolated in his life. He retreated further into himself, into the cold comfort of his visions, the darkness within him beginning to swell, to fester, to embrace the monster they all believed him to be. The line between punishing the guilty and reveling in their suffering had always been a razor's edge for Konrad Curze. Now that edge was gone, eroded by the constant acid of his visions and the galaxy's refusal to heed his warnings. He no longer sought to simply create fear as a means to an end. Fear had become the end in itself, the only truth he could rely on, the only language the deaf universe seemed to understand. This horrifying evolution was laid bare for the entire Imperium to witness during the second compliance of Chiraut. The planet, having fallen back into rebellion after its initial pacification, was to be made an example of. But this was not the surgical terror of before. This was a symphony of sadism. The planetary governor, who had publicly renounced his oaths to the Emperor, was captured not for execution, but for art. A horrifying living art. Curze ordered his flesh rites to flay the man alive, keeping him conscious through a cocktail of stimulants and pain blockers. Every nerve was on fire, every moment an eternity of agony. And it was all broadcast on every picked screen and Vox channel to every citizen on the planet. They watched for 3 days as their leader was meticulously deconstructed his pleas for death, turning to incoherent moans and finally to a rattling silence. When it was over, his skinless, still-breathing form was hung from the Capitol spire, a crimson pendulum of imperial justice. The rebellion on Chiraut died not with a bang, but with a galaxy-wide horrified gasp. The message was clear: this was no longer about compliance. This was about punishment on a theological scale, and Curze had appointed himself its unforgiving god. This descent into absolute brutality was not Curze's alone. It was a poison that seeped down through the very soul of his legion. The Night Lords had always been grim and silent predators, but now a depraved glee entered their work. They were no longer merely soldiers employing a brutal tactic. They were becoming the monsters their Primarch was accused of being. They began to take trophies, flayed skins, skulls, weeping eyes preserved in stasis jars. Their war cries, once disciplined and rare, became shrieks of manic laughter that echoed across blasted battlefields. This spiritual decay found its perfect avatar in First Captain Jago Sevatarian, known to the Legion as Sevatar, Prince of Crows. Sevatar was the id of the Night Lords made manifest. He was a cynic, a murderer, and a philosopher of nihilism. He saw the hypocrisy of the Great Crusade, the lie at the heart of the Imperium, and met it not with despair, but with a smirk and a blooded blade. While Curze was haunted by his visions, Sevatar was liberated by the pointlessness of it all. Justice is a fool's word, he was fond of saying. There is only the act and the consequences. He led the Atramentar, the elite Terminators of the Legion, and they became the foremost practitioners of the new, unrestrained cruelty. They did not just kill, they savored it, turning battle into a canvas for their atrocities. Sevatar was everything Curze was, but without the torment of prophecy. He was the gleeful monster, the sane man in a legion of the mad, and his loyalty to his Primarch was absolute. For in Curze's descent, he saw his own grim worldview being validated with every scream. The massacre at Chiraut was an atrocity too public to ignore. It sent a shockwave of revulsion through the command structure of the Great Crusade, and the task of confronting the Night Haunter fell to the one Primarch whose temperament was the polar opposite of Curze's Rogel Dawn. The Praetorian of Terror Primarch of the Imperial Fists arrived aboard his flagship, the Phalanx, a vessel of order and martial perfection, and requested a private audience with his brother. The meeting took place in the strategium of Curze's flagship, the Nightfall, a chamber that stank of old blood and ozone. Dawn, clad in his immaculate golden armor, was a pillar of unyielding principle. Curze, pale and gaunt, seemed more wraith than demigod. Dawn did not waste time with pleasantries. Your actions on Chiraut are a stain upon the Imperium's honor and a mockery of the Emperor's law, he stated, his voice flat and accusatory. You are to cease these methods at once and submit your legion for penitent reassignment. Curze met the accusation with a weary smile. Honor law, he mused. These are the words of children Rogel. Pretty cages you build to hide from the truth. The truth is that the galaxy is a pit of vipers, and you do not reason with a snake. You cut off its head. I did what was necessary. Dawn's fists clenched. Necessary? You tortured a man for days and broadcast it for sport. That is not necessity, it is madness. The word hung in the air between them, a spark in a room filled with explosives. Madness, Curze whispered, is seeing the abyss and pretending it is not there. Madness is seeing the future, screaming it from the rooftops, and being called a liar by your own blind brothers. The dam of Curze's restraint, weakened by years of visions and rejection, finally broke. With a shriek that was part fury and part despair, he lunged across the table. He was not just a Primarch attacking another, he was a prophet trying to force a revelation. The two demigods clashed in a blur of motion, Ceramite screaming against Ceramite. Dawn was the stronger, the more disciplined fighter, a master of defense. But Curze was a whirlwind of unpredictable, feral rage. He was not trying to win a duel, he was trying to break through Dawn's wall of certainty. As they grappled, Curze pushed his psychic power, the curse of his foresight, into Dawn's mind. He forced his brother to see. Rogel Dawn, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, saw what Konrad Curze saw every waking second. He saw the skies of terror turn to fire. He saw the walls of his own imperial palace, the greatest fortress in the galaxy, breached and broken. He saw the bodies of his imperial fists littering the marble steps. He saw Horus transformed into a monster of chaos, standing triumphant over a broken imperium. He felt the despair, the hopelessness, the absolute certainty of failure. The vision was a psychic hammer blow, and Dawn staggered back, his mind reeling, his stoic composure shattered by the sheer, unfiltered horror of it. For a moment, Curze stood panting over him, a wild, triumphant look in his eyes. "You see," he rasped. "You see what is coming. This is the future you are so blindly marching towards." But the revelation did not bring understanding. It brought condemnation. To Dawn, this psychic assault was the ultimate violation, the final proof of Curze's instability. The truth of the vision was irrelevant. The act itself was unforgivable heresy. Before Curze could press his advantage, he was beset by Dawn's Huskarls, the elite of the Imperial Fists who had stormed the chamber at the sound of battle. There was a brief, brutal struggle, but Curze was overwhelmed. He was disarmed and shackled to the cold iron of the restraints, a final, damning judgment. He had attacked a fellow Primarch. He had broken the single most sacred law of their brotherhood. As he was led away in chains, he looked back at Dawn, who was still pale and shaken from the vision. Curze began to laugh, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed through the halls of his ship. He had shown his brother the truth of their damnation, and his reward was imprisonment. He was right. He had always been right. And for that he would be condemned. The feeling was not one of defeat, but of a bitter, terrible vindication. While Konrad Curze sat in the brig of the Phalanx, a caged monster awaiting a trial that would never come, news reached him from the far side of the galaxy. It was a report from his home, Nostramo Quintus. In his absence, with the suffocating pressure of his fear lifted, the world had not blossomed into a model of imperial compliance. It had regressed. The old ways, the darkness and corruption he had so violently purged, had seeped back from the cracks. The ruling councils he had installed had become dens of greed and petty ambition. The criminal syndicates had re-emerged from the deepest levels of the hives, more vicious and depraved than before. The silence of fear he had imposed had not been a foundation for a new society. It had merely been a pause, a held breath, before an even deeper plunge into damnation. Recruitment for the Night Lords had become a harvest of the most violent and irredeemable scum the planet had to offer, tainting his legion's gene stock with pure malevolence. His grand experiment had been an abject failure. He had not cleansed Nostramo. He had merely terrorized it into a temporary, resentful submission. His legacy upon his own world was nothing but a power vacuum, a scar that had become infected the moment he turned his back. The news broke something deep within him. It was the final, definitive proof of his failure. His entire philosophy, the core belief that fear could be a scalpel to excise the cancer of society, was a lie. Fear did not create order. It only created a desperate hunger for the moment the fear was gone. It did not teach, it only traumatized. As he sat in his cell, the future unspooled before him, the heresy now not just a vision, but an approaching certainty. He managed to escape his confinement, whether through his own cunning or the chaos of the coming war was never clear, and he did not race to terror to face judgment. He pointed the prow of the Nightfall back towards the one place that represented the sum of all his failures. He gathered his fleet, the scattered ships of the 8th Legion, and brought them home. When they arrived in the Nostramo system, there was no planetary communication, no grand welcome for their returning Primarch. There was only a command issued from the lips of Konrad Curze himself, a command of such finality and nihilism that it shocked even his most bloodthirsty captains. Exterminatus. The command was carried out without question. The cyclonic torpedoes were launched. Lances of pure energy designed to kill worlds sliced through the void. From the observation deck of the Nightfall, Konrad Curze watched his homeworld die. He watched the lances strike the fragile crust he himself had breached as an infant. He saw the planet's atmosphere ignite in a flash of chemical fire, a brief, beautiful dawn for a world that had only known night. He saw the adamantium hives melt and run like wax, the foundations of his bone palace vaporizing in an instant. Finally, he watched as the planet's core was breached, and Nostramo Quintus, the cradle of his misery and the forge of his soul, tore itself apart in a cataclysm of fire and exploding rock. As the last fragments of his home scattered into the void, a single black tear traced a path down his pale cheek. It was not a tear of grief for the billions of lives he had just extinguished. It was a tear for the death of his own ideal, a final silent admission of his utter and complete failure. He had set out to save his world with terror and had ended up destroying it with judgment. With that single act of planetary fratricide, Curze severed his final tenuous link to the Imperium and the man he had once called father. There was no going back. He could not claim to serve an empire whose laws he had so monumentally broken. He could not claim to be a savior when he had just annihilated his own people. He was no longer a prodigal son or a troubled general. He was an outlaw, a monster, a king of a dead kingdom adrift in a galaxy he knew was about to burn. The destruction of Nostramo was not just an act of rage. In his twisted mind, it was an act of mercy. He had passed final judgment on a failed experiment, and in doing so had liberated himself. He no longer had a home to protect or a legacy to build. All that was left was the prophecy, the bloody path laid out before him, and a terrible, exhilarating freedom to be the monster everyone had always said he was. Adrift in the void, a pariah even before the great betrayal was made known, Konrad Curze was a wound waiting to be infected. It was then that the message came. It did not arrive through official imperial channels, but through secret encrypted astropathic relays. It was a message from Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the Emperor's most favored son. Horus, who had always shown Curze a measure of guarded respect, now reached out with words that were not of command, but of comradeship. He did not offer Curze power or glory or a place in a new order. He offered something far more seductive, something Curze had craved his entire life understanding. "I have seen the truth, brother," the message whispered in Curze's mind. "I have seen the lie on the golden throne. The Emperor is not a father, he is a master. He does not seek to enlighten the galaxy, but to enslave it to his own cold, godless vision. He speaks of truth, yet he has lied to us all. He used you, Konrad. He used your unique sight, your necessary cruelty, and then he condemned you for it when it became inconvenient. He was never going to accept you. You were always just his monster to be chained up when the dirty work was done. I understand your pain. Join me, and we will tear down this empire of hypocrisy and build a new one, a true one, where all his sons are given their due respect." For another Primarch, the appeal might have been to ambition like Lorgar, or to pride like Perturabo. But Horus, ever the master of temptation, knew exactly which strings to pull with the Night Haunter. He offered empathy. He validated Curze's entire life of suffering and rejection. He confirmed Curze's deepest, most cynical beliefs about their father and his Imperium. Curze listened to the message, and in the swirling chaos of his visions, he saw the path ahead solidify. He had already seen the heresy. He had seen Horus's betrayal, the galactic civil war, the death of brothers. He knew that this moment was an inevitability, another stone on the immutable path of fate. His choice was not a true choice at all. It was merely the act of accepting the role that destiny had already written for him. He did not join Horus to win or to rule, or even to get revenge. He joined Horus to prove that he was right. He joined to make the universe bear witness to the future he had so often described. In his mind, by taking the side of the betrayer, he was not committing treason. He was committing himself to the truth. The decision was not debated among the Night Lords, it was simply declared. There was no grand speech, no appeal to loyalty. Curze simply gave the order, set a course for the Istvan system. His captain's men, like Sevatar, who had long since abandoned any pretense of loyalty to the distant throne world, complied without question. To them, the Imperium was a lie, and Horus's rebellion was simply a more honest form of the galactic conquest they were already engaged in. The Night Lord's fleet, a collection of dark, predator-class vessels adorned with trophies of bone and flayed skin, turned towards the coming storm. They arrived at Istvan V as the third wave of the ambush, a fleet of ghosts appearing from the void to seal the doom of the loyalist legions trapped on the planet's surface. The Night Lords fell upon the shattered Raven Guard, and salamanders not as soldiers, but as jackals upon a wounded lion. They took no grand strategic objectives. They simply indulged their most depraved instincts, sowing terror and chaos among the broken loyalists. For Konrad Curze, the drop site massacre was not a battle. It was a prophecy made manifest. As he watched his legion tear apart the sons of his former brothers, he felt no triumph, no glee. He felt only the cold, hollow satisfaction of a prophet whose direst warnings had finally tragically come true. He had chosen the side of fate, and its first chapter was being written in the blood of his kin. During the galactic civil war that followed the Horus heresy, the Night Lords did not operate as a conventional army. Curze had no interest in capturing worlds for the War Master or holding strategic territory. To him, the war was not a contest of empires, but the final bloody act of a deterministic play. His role was not that of a general, but of a universal agent of terror. He turned his legion loose upon the eastern fringe, unleashing them upon a swath of the Imperium, designated Segmentum Ultima. They did not conquer, they ravaged. They would descend upon loyalist worlds, broadcast messages of despair, conduct public executions, and then vanish back into the void, leaving behind a planet traumatized, broken, and useless to the Imperial war effort. Curze was proving a point on a galactic scale that the Imperium's control was an illusion, its promises of safety a lie, and that in the end there was only darkness and fear. This campaign of nihilistic terror eventually brought him into direct conflict with a legion and a Primarch, who were in their own way masters of shadow and fear the Dark Angels and Lion L. Johnson. The Thramers' Crusade became one of the most brutal sub-campaigns of the entire heresy. It was a war fought not in pitched battles, but in ambushes, feints, and lightning raids across dozens of star systems. The Lion, grim and calculating, fought to contain the Night Lords and secure the region for the Loyalists. Curze, in contrast, fought for nothing but the perpetuation of chaos itself. The conflict quickly became a deeply personal affair between the two Primarchs, two sides of the same dark coin. The Lion was the disciplined hunter, the Knight of the Darkness. Curze was the feral, unpredictable phantom. It became a cosmic game of cat and mouse. Curze delighted in the chase, leaving taunting messages for his brother, displaying the bodies of captured Dark Angels in grotesque tableaus for the Lion to find. He sought to psychologically dismantle the Lion to peel back his veneer of knightly honor and expose the ruthless pragmatist beneath. He would appear on the Lion's command frequency, his voice a low, mocking whisper describing visions of Caliban's fall and Luther's betrayal, planting seeds of doubt and paranoia in his brother's mind. Ultimately, however, the Lion's discipline and the sheer martial power of the Dark Angels proved superior to the Night Lord's chaotic terror tactics. In a series of cunning traps and strategic masterstrokes, the Lion cornered Curze's scattered fleet. The final confrontation was a boarding action on the Nightfall. The Lion himself led the assault, and the two Primarchs finally met face to face, not in a debate hall, but on a blood-slicked command deck. Their duel was a thing of savage legend. The Lion was the superior swordsman, his movements precise and deadly. Curze was a berserker, his lightning claws tearing chunks from the Lion's armor, his fighting style utterly without form or honor. For all his ferocity, Curze was eventually defeated, wounded, and overpowered by his implacable brother. He was captured and put in chains once more, this time in the stasis vaults of the Dark Angel's flagship. But even in defeat, Curze claimed victory. As he was dragged away, he laughed, spitting blood and prophecies at the Lion. "You hold me, brother," he snarled, "but you cannot hold back the future. You think you fight for loyalty, you don't even know the meaning of the word. Go ask Luther. Even in chains, the Night Haunter was still hunting his words, the deadliest poison of all. Curze's imprisonment did not last. During a chaotic battle with a rival traitor legion, he managed to escape the Lion's flagship, absconding with a small portion of his fleet and vanishing into the tormented void. But the Primarch who emerged was not the same one who had been captured. The duel with the Lion, the physical and psychic wounds he had sustained, and the long, silent contemplation in the stasis field had shattered the last vestiges of his sanity. He was no longer a general, not even a prophet. He was simply a vessel for his agonizing visions, a ghost haunting the wreckage of his own life. He retreated to the deepest chambers of the Nightfall and ceased to command. His legion, which had followed him out of fear and a shared nihilistic worldview, was now rudderless, its mad king having abdicated all responsibility. Curze created a new throne room for himself, a sanctum of madness. He had the walls upholstered with the freshly flayed skins of his captives, their faces stretched into silent screams. He would spend his days and nights there, conversing with the corpses of his brothers as he saw them in his visions, arguing with phantoms, and tracing the patterns of the future in the bloodstains on the floor. The Legion, without the unifying force of their Primarch's will, began to fracture. The command structure, always tenuous, collapsed entirely. It was Sevatar, the ever-pragmatic first captain, who recognized the truth first. He saw that his father was lost, a rambling lunatic who was a danger to them all. "The Primarch is unwell," Sevatar announced to the other captains in a council of war. "He speaks to ghosts and weeps at things that have not happened. The Night Haunter is gone. Only Konrad Curze remains, and he is a liability." Sevatar, in a desperate attempt to maintain cohesion, tried to seize control. He declared that the Night Lords would no longer drift aimlessly, but would fight for their own survival and their own spoils. He tried to forge the Legion into a force loyal not to a broken demigod, but to the practical principles of terror and piracy. But the cult of personality around Curze, even a mad Curze, was too strong for some and too weak for others. The Legion's inherent individualism, its celebration of the lone predator, proved to be its undoing. The Night Lords broke apart. It was not a clean schism, but a slow, ugly disintegration. Captains took their ships and their companies and simply left, striking out on their own. They became pirates, mercenaries, and corsairs, each warband leader carving out his own petty empire of fear in the dark corners of the galaxy. The Legion ceased to exist as a unified fighting force. They became a diaspora of killers and monsters united only by their shared gene seed, their pale skin, and their penchant for atrocity. They were no longer the Night Lords. They were simply Night Lords' individual predators hunting in the dark. The grand, tragic purpose of Konrad Curze, his desire to save the galaxy through fear, had rotted from the inside out. His legacy was not a pacified Imperium or a vindicated prophecy, but a scattered pack of rabid dogs let loose upon the galaxy to kill and maim for their own amusement. On his throne of skin, surrounded by ghosts, the Night Haunter reigned over a broken and scattered kingdom, the absolute monarch of his own madness. After the death of Horus and the end of the Siege of Terra, the broken traitor legions fled to the sanctuary of the Eye of Terror, all except the Night Lords, or rather what was left of them. Curze, in a rare moment of lucidity, had guided his personal fleet to a dead world on the eastern fringe, a desolate rock named Tsagwalsa. Here he established his final squalid court. The planet became the capital of a small empire of terror, a bastion for the scattered remnants of his legion who still answered his call. But Curze no longer waged war. He no longer sought to conquer or to prove a point. His fighting was over. He would spend his days upon his throne, a silent, brooding figure, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. He was waiting. His remaining captains' warlords, like the Talon Master Zio Sahal, grew restless. They urged their Primarch to action, to lead them on a new, long war against the Imperium he hated. They saw a galaxy ripe for the taking, an empire weakened and mourning. In one of his last coherent addresses to his sons, Curze explained his inaction. He gathered his inner circle, the grizzled veterans who had followed him from the darkness of Nostramo to this final, lightless shore. "You wish for war?" he asked them, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "The war is over. We did not win, but I did not lose. I have proven my truth. Everything I saw has come to pass. The Golden Throne is a tomb. The Emperor is a corpse god. The Imperium is a kingdom of blind faith and fearful whispers. My purpose was never to rule. It was to be the mirror, to show the Imperium the monster lurking behind its own righteous mask. Now all that is left is the final act of my prophecy, the final proof." His sons did not understand. They saw a Primarch wallowing in nihilism, a leader who had given up. They could not comprehend that for Curze the waiting was the final battle. He was not seeking forgiveness or redemption. He was seeking affirmation, the final bloody signature on the testament of his life. He was waiting for the assassin he had seen in his visions for over 100 years. He was waiting for his death. In the Sol system, bathed in the psychic light of the Astronomicon, the High Lords of Terror made a decision. The renegade Primarch Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, was too dangerous a symbol to be left alive. His small empire on Sagwalsa was a festering sore, a reminder of the traitor legion's continued existence. A simple military campaign was deemed too costly, the price in ships and men to kill one broken demigod too high. A more precise solution was required. The Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum was summoned. The order was given: kill the Night Haunter. It was a mission deemed all but impossible. To assassinate a Primarch, a being of near-divine power, speed, and intellect within his own fortress surrounded by the remnants of his legion, it was a suicide mission. And for such a task, there was only one temple and one assassin with the skill set required. The Kalidas Temple Masters of Disguise and Infiltration was chosen. The agent selected was Mchen, one of the most gifted assassins in the temple's history. Mchen was the pinnacle of human lethality, her body sculpted by genetic engineering, and her mind honed by a lifetime of brutal training. She was a polymorph, able to change her shape and appearance at will. She received her briefing studying the tactical readouts of Curze's fortress, the disposition of his forces, the psychological profiles of his lieutenants. She knew the odds were astronomically against her. She prepared for her mission with cold, dispassionate professionalism. The journey to Tsagwalsa was a ghost run through hostile territory. Her infiltration of the planet itself was a masterwork of stealth. She moved through the Night Lord's patrols like a whisper on the wind, a shadow among shadows. She slipped through the fortress's defenses, past sonic detectors and pressure plates, through guard posts manned by transhuman killers whose senses could detect the heartbeat of a mouse at 100 paces. And as she drew closer to the heart of the fortress, to the Primarch's throne room, a strange, unsettling feeling began to grow within her. It was too easy. Gates were left unlocked. Patrols inexplicably turned down the wrong corridor just as she approached. It felt less like an infiltration and more like she was being permitted entry, guided down a path that had been cleared specifically for her. The professional killer in her screamed that it was a trap, but her orders were absolute. She pressed on the Citan phase sword on her back, humming softly, ready to slay a god. The final doors to the throne room slid open without a sound. Mchen slipped inside her body, tensed for the final, desperate confrontation. The room was a cathedral of horror. The walls were covered in flayed skin, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and despair. And there, upon a massive throne of bone and screaming metal, sat Konrad Curze. He was not on guard. He was not surrounded by an elite retinue. He was alone, slumped in his seat, looking gaunt and weary. He was not looking at the door through which she had entered. He was looking directly at the shadowy alcove where she had concealed herself, his dark eyes seeming to pierce the very veil of her stealth field. Mchen froze, her professional calm momentarily shattered. He knew. He had known she was coming. "It took you long enough," Curze's voice echoed in the cavernous hall. It was not the voice of a snarling warlord, but of a man tired beyond all measure. He slowly rose from his throne, his immense height, casting a long, terrifying shadow across the room. He made no move to arm himself. His lightning claws lay dormant on the armrests of his throne. "I have seen you in my head for a century, assassin. I saw your face when you were still a child in the Schola Progenium. I saw you chosen for this mission. I have watched your every step across my world." Mchen remained silent, her mind racing. This was not how it was supposed to be. There was meant to be a fight, a struggle. This was a reception. "You are the Emperor's Justice," Curze continued, taking a slow step forward. A killer in the dark sent to silence a son who told the truth. How gloriously hypocritical. He condemns my methods, my use of fear and assassination, yet here you are, his finest tool. He spread his arms wide, leaving himself completely exposed. "Your purpose is to kill me. My purpose is to die. Do not think this is your victory. This is mine. My death will prove everything. It will prove that I saw the future. It will prove that your master is a tyrant who fears the truth. It will prove that the justice of the Imperium is a murderer's whisper. It is the final piece of my prophecy, the ultimate vindication. M'Shen hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Her training, her entire being was screaming at the wrongness of the situation. But her mission was clear. She was the weapon, and the target was before her, offering himself for the final blow. She burst from the shadows, a blur of black synth skin, the Setan phase sword activating with an otherworldly hum. She was an avatar of death, moving with speed that would be impossible for any normal human. Curze did not move to defend himself. He simply watched her approach, a faint, tragic smile on his lips. As the deadliest assassin of the age closed the distance to deliver the killing blow to a demigod, the Primarch of the Viet Legion spoke his final words. They were not a plea, not a curse, not a prayer. They were a statement of victory, a final declaration of his life's terrible purpose, echoing in the assassin's mind as much as in the air. Death is nothing, Konrad Curze said, compared to vindication. The phase sword struck true. The impossible blade which flickered between dimensions passed through the Primarch's power armor as if it were not there. It slid between his twin hearts, severing his lifeblood at the source. The light in Konrad Curze's eyes, a light that had seen so much horror, finally extinguished. The giant of a man, the night haunter, the ghost of Nostromo, collapsed to the floor of his profane throne room, his body falling with the sound of finality, like a statue toppling in a forgotten city. It was over. The mission was complete. M'Shen stood over the corpse of the demigod she had just slain. The silence in the room was absolute, profound and heavier than any sound she had ever heard. There was no triumph in her soul, no feeling of a job well done. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. She had followed her orders. She had killed the monster. But his last words, his willing acceptance of his own demise, haunted her. She looked at the dead Primarch, and for the first time she did not see a traitor or a butcher. She saw a man who had orchestrated his own execution to prove a point. She had been his tool, his final witness. She had won the fight, but as she stood there in the echoing silence, she had the sickening feeling that Konrad Curze had won the war. The assassination of Konrad Curze did not end the threat of the Night Lords. In fact, it immortalized it. For the scattered, broken war bands of the Viet Legion, the news of their Primarch's death at the hands of an Imperial assassin was not a defeat. It was a canonization. Their mad, brooding father had been right all along. He had predicted his own death. He had proven the hypocrisy of the Corpse Emperor. His death transformed him from a failed leader into a martyred prophet. His final words, "Death is nothing compared to vindication," became their gospel, a sacred creed of nihilism and hatred. The Night Lords would continue their long war for 10,000 years, no longer for a war master or a cause, but in the name of the Night Haunter's truth. They would continue to be the mirror he always wanted to be, showing the Imperium its own monstrous reflection in the atrocities they committed in his name. In the official histories of the Imperium, Konrad Curze is recorded as a traitor, a monster, a madman who was justly executed for his crimes. His story is a cautionary tale, a lesson on the dangers of straying from the Emperor's light. But for those few who study the shadows of history, the question remains a persistent, uncomfortable whisper in the dark. Was he truly born a monster, a flawed seed from the very beginning, or was he a prophet cursed with the agony of a truth no one else could bear to see? Could he have been saved, his dark path diverted if only a single person, his father, a brother, had listened, had offered understanding instead of condemnation? Or was his tragedy, like all the others in this grim, dark galaxy, simply inevitable? His legacy was not one of conquest or of faith, but of a terrible, unanswered question. The rain no longer falls on Nostromo. The world is dust, its memory a scar in the void. And the mind that was a fractured sea of glass is finally mercifully still. The story of Konrad Curze, when stripped of the weight of propaganda and the glory of myth, is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a perfect tragedy, a story whose every step was guided by an inexorable, malicious fate. It is the story of a being cursed with the ability to see the future, but denied the power to change it. He was a physician who could diagnose the disease festering in the soul of the Imperium, but whose every attempt to cut out the cancer was seen as an act of butchery. He saw the hypocrisy at the heart of the Great Crusade, the lie coiled beneath the Golden Throne, and in his desperate, clumsy, violent attempts to make others see, he became the embodiment of the very darkness he sought to expose. He did not want to save humanity through hope or valor. He wanted to save it from itself with the cold, hard, cauterizing brand of fear. He believed that if people were afraid enough of the consequences, they would choose order. He made his homeworld quiet, but he did not make it peaceful. He gave his legion the tools of terror, but he could not stop them from falling in love with their work. He was a king who ruled a kingdom of silence, a general who commanded an army of nightmares, and a son who saw the flaw in his father's grand design from the very beginning. His tragedy was not that he fell to chaos, for he never truly did. He never gave himself to the dark gods, never sought power from the warp. He served only one master, the grim, unchangeable truth of his own visions. His damnation was to be the sole sane man in a galaxy going mad, but his sanity was a strain of such prophetic horror that it looked to everyone else like the most profound madness of all. Was he a monster without question? His hands are stained with the blood of billions. He crucified his enemies, built thrones from their bones, and found a certain satisfaction in the artistry of pain. He was cruel, paranoid, and unstable. But his monstrosity was not born of ambition or a lust for power. It was the desperate, flailing rage of a trapped animal, an existence defined by the agony of a future he could see, but not prevent. He screamed his warnings, and when no one listened, he became the warning itself. He became the living proof that the Imperium, for all its talk of enlightenment, was a machine that created monsters. It took a child with a supernatural sense of justice, threw him into a pit of unending night, and then acted surprised when he emerged with shadows in his soul. It gave him a legion of killers, ordered him to terrorize the galaxy into submission, and then condemned him for being too good at his job. In the end, the final echoing question that is the true legacy of the Night Haunter is not whether he was a prophet or a monster. It is a far more disturbing question, one that strikes at the heart of the grim, dark universe he inhabited. What is more terrifying, a creature of the night who knows it is a monster, who is honest in its cruelty and clear in its nihilistic purpose, or a gilded Imperium that commits genocide in the name of progress that demands conformity through violence that creates creatures like Konrad, Curze, and then condemns them for what they have become. His life was a scream of agony and rage. His death was a calculated act of philosophical defiance, but the silence he left behind, the vacuum, filled only by that lingering, terrible question, is perhaps more frightening than any sound he ever made. It is the silence that follows a prophecy, fulfilled, the silence that reminds the galaxy of the truth it refuses to see.